Have you ever wondered what it would be like to live in a world constantly on the brink of total annihilation? A world where two superpowers, armed with enough nuclear weapons to destroy the planet many times over, faced each other in a tense 40-year standoff. This wasn't a movie plot. This was the reality of the Cold War. It wasn't a war fought with soldiers on a traditional battlefield, but a war of ideologies, of spies, of technological races, and of proxy conflicts that shaped the very world we live in today. So, buckle up, because we're about to take a deep dive into one of the most fascinating and terrifying periods in human history. Our story begins in the ashes of World War II. The once mighty European empires were shattered, leaving two new giants standing tall, the United States and the Soviet Union. On the surface, they were allies who had just defeated a common enemy. But beneath that fragile alliance, deep-seated mistrust was brewing. The United States championed democracy and capitalism, a system built on individual freedom and free markets. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, was the world's first communist state, advocating for a world where the state controlled all property and economic activity, theoretically, for the benefit of all. These two ideologies were like oil and water. They simply couldn't mix. The tension became official in 1946 when former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill delivered his famous Iron Curtain speech. He declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, dividing the continent into two hostile camps. To the west, the free, democratic nations; to the east, the communist countries under the tight grip of the Soviet Union. This speech perfectly captured the new reality. Europe was now the primary chessboard in a global game of power. The United States responded with a policy of containment. The idea, championed by diplomat George Kennan, was not to attack the Soviet Union directly, but to prevent communism from spreading to other countries. This led to the Truman Doctrine, where the US pledged to support any nation resisting communist takeovers. The first beneficiaries were Greece and Turkey, who received massive financial aid to fend off communist insurgencies. This was followed by the Marshall Plan, an ambitious program that poured billions of dollars into rebuilding war-torn Western Europe. The logic was simple. Prosperous, stable countries would be less likely to fall for the promises of communism. The Soviets saw this as economic warfare. They tightened their control over Eastern Europe, creating a buffer zone of satellite states like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. The first major crisis erupted in Germany. The country and its capital, Berlin, had been divided into 4 occupation zones by the victorious Allies. In 1948, the Soviets decided to blockade West Berlin, which was located deep inside their zone, cutting off all land and water access. They hoped to starve the city into submission. The US and its allies responded not with tanks, but with planes. For nearly a year, the Berlin airlift flew in food, fuel, and supplies around the clock, a stunning logistical feat that kept 2 million West Berliners alive and free. The Soviets eventually lifted the blockade, but the division of Germany was sealed. In 1949, the country was formally split into West Germany and East Germany, a division that would last for 40 years. That same year, two massive events shifted the balance of power. First, the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb, ending America's nuclear monopoly. The world now had two nuclear-armed powers, and the fear of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, became a grim reality. Second, China, the world's most populous country, fell to communism under Mao Zedong. The containment policy seemed to be failing in Asia. This new reality prompted the creation of military alliances. In 1949, the United States, Canada, and 10 Western European nations formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. The core principle was collective defense. An attack on one member was an attack on all. The Soviet Union responded in 1955 by creating the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance of its Eastern European satellite states. The world was now formally divided into two armed camps, staring each other down across the Iron Curtain. The Cold War wasn't just fought with treaties and threats, it was also a race for technological supremacy. When the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, in 1957, it sent shockwaves through America. The space race was on boob. It was about more than just national pride. It was about proving which system, capitalism or communism, was superior. This competition spurred incredible innovation, leading to the creation of NASA, and culminating in the United States landing a man on the moon in 1969. The technological race also extended to the military, with both sides developing ever more powerful missiles, submarines, and spy planes. While the superpowers avoided direct conflict, they fought each other through proxy wars across the globe. The first major one was the Korean War in the early 1950s, when Communist North Korea invaded South Korea. The United States, under the banner of the United Nations, intervened to push them back. The war ended in a stalemate, with the country still divided today along the 38th parallel. Perhaps the most famous and divisive proxy war was the Vietnam War. What began as a local independence movement against French colonial rule evolved into a full-blown conflict between the Communist North and the US-backed South. America poured in troops and resources, but became bogged down in a brutal guerrilla war that it couldn't win. The war deeply divided American society and ultimately ended in a humiliating US withdrawal and a communist victory in 1975. The Cold War also had its moments of extreme tension, where the world held its breath. The most dangerous of these was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The Soviet Union secretly began placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. When U.S. spy planes discovered the sites, President John F. Kennedy imposed a naval quarantine around the island and demanded the missiles be removed. For 13 terrifying days, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. Tense negotiations and a secret back-channel deal where the US agreed not to invade Cuba and secretly promised to remove its own missiles from Turkey finally resolved the crisis. It was a sobering moment that led to a slight thaw in relations and the establishment of a hotline between Washington and Moscow to prevent future miscalculations. The 1970s saw a period of détente, or a relaxation of tensions. Leaders like Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev signed treaties to limit the number of nuclear weapons, like the SALT agreements. But this thaw proved temporary. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 shattered détente and plunged the world back into a deep freeze. The US boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics, and the Soviets returned the favor at the 1984 Los Angeles Games. The beginning of the end came in the 1980s. US President Ronald Reagan took a hardline stance against the Soviet Union, famously calling it an evil empire. He initiated a massive military buildup, including the controversial Star Wars missile defense program, putting immense economic pressure on the Soviets to keep up. But the real change came from within the Soviet Union itself. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. He recognized that the Soviet system was crumbling under the weight of economic stagnation and the costly arms race. He introduced two radical new policies: glasnost, meaning openness, which allowed for more freedom of speech and criticism of the government, and peer restructuring, which aimed to reform the stagnant communist economy. Gorbachev's reforms unleashed forces he couldn't control. All across Eastern Europe, people who had lived under Soviet domination for decades rose up and demanded freedom. In 1989, Poland held free elections. Hungary opened its border with Austria. And then, the most iconic moment of all, on November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall, the ultimate symbol of the Cold War, came down. People from East and West Berlin swarmed the wall, celebrating together in a scene of pure joy. One by one, the communist regimes of Eastern Europe collapsed. Within the Soviet Union itself, its constituent republics began declaring independence. In 1991, a failed coup by hardline communists against Gorbachev sealed the Soviet Union's fate. On Christmas Day 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned, and the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The Cold War was over. The end of the Cold War reshaped the entire global landscape. The United States was left as the world's sole superpower, but the legacy of this 40-year struggle is complex. It was a period of immense fear and danger, but it also saw incredible technological progress and, thankfully, avoided a direct catastrophic war between the superpowers. It's a story of ideology, power, espionage, and the enduring human desire for freedom. Understanding the Cold War is essential to understanding the world we live in today, from the alliances that still exist to the conflicts that continue to simmer. Thanks for watching. If you found this journey through history interesting, do not forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. See you next time.